Enjoying your dinner, and it's now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening, Kate Gordon. Kate has asked me to keep my introduction very brief, and I'm happy to do that because I'm very eager to hear her speak again. But she does have we have a bio for her in your journals and online, of course, and she has a very impressive background that I really encourage you all to look into. But Kate Gordon now leads the energy and climate team at Next Generation. And for the past 18 months, she has also served as the executive director of the Risky Business Project, which is an initiative to quantify and publicize the economic risks of climate change, and it's co-chaired by Michael Bloomberg, Hank Paulson, and Tom Steyer. Kate has worked on a variety of economic development and social justice issues for many years, and is regarded as a leader in the green jobs movement. She writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal and Huffington Post, and very prolifically, I might add, and right on point. I really encourage you to read her stuff. And because we have a higher ed crowd, I would be remiss not to mention that she earned a JD and a master's degree in city planning from the University of California, Berkeley, where she was editor-in-chief of the Berkeley Journal of Employment and Labor Law, and she received her undergraduate degree from Wesleyan University. So please join me in welcoming Kate Gordon.
Thanks, everybody. It is so great to be here. There's my clicker. Okay. And thanks particularly to Tony and George, of course, who invited me after we met at I always get the acronym wrong, but American College and University Presidents Conference, Climate Conference meeting, whatever it is, that acronym. And I have to say that I was then and am now particularly happy to be talking to people who are involved with universities in various roles, just really because universities and colleges are at the crosshairs of this climate risk issue we've all been talking about. They're very place-based. I mean, you're not going to move, ASU to Portland, Oregon, just because of climate risks. So there's a very real and present sort of extreme weather and heat impact. Your education focus, so there's a special responsibility to train the next generation of people to be thinking about these issues in a holistic way and be the workers who deal with these issues. And also, many of you here are investors who are dealing with funds that are simultaneously keeping your universities afloat, but also have to be responsive to students and faculty in a very different way than many investors do. I think even more so than pension funds, which are often put out there as a similar set of investments, just because of the special university role in the community and as educators. So climate change is one of these tough issues to work on because the impacts are very local and the solutions are usually very global, and universities are both local and global, and so you're at a really interesting place to tackle these issues, and I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about it. I should say that right off the bat that I am not an expert on investment, and I'm not a divestment person. What I really am is somebody who saw a gap a couple of years ago to try to get the climate debate nationally out of these rabbit holes that I felt like we'd fallen into, the debate over the science and the debate over the right policy response. Both of those are very partisan and have moved us in this direction of sort of being unable to discuss. So most people in the country can't access either of those conversations. The debate over the science, it's a scientific debate. The debate over the policy solution is the Washington debate. It's very hard for most people to engage on either of those and feel like either of them is actionable in any way. And so we took a look a couple years ago and basically said, how do we change the whole climate debate in the United States? Yes, this was a very small goal that we had. How do we change the climate debate in the United States to being one that's about mainstream economics and businesses and mainstream decision making, and not about these two areas that are just hard for people to get their heads around? When we started the project, I met Next Generation, which is based in San Francisco. We're a nonpartisan think tank that was started by Tom Steyer, actually when he was still at Farallon Capital. And his life has taken a dramatic turn since then. And I just want to say right now, I do not know if Tom Steyer is running for U.S. Senate. Do not ask me that question. I don't know the answer to that question. He just said on Reddit again today that he hasn't made a decision yet. So that's the official role. But Tom is, of course, in the news a lot now, but really best known in the investment world, I think, for starting Fairlawn Capital and at his time at Goldman before that. And then we also brought in, right after Tom, we brought in Mike Bloomberg and then Hank Paulson to the project. And we were just talking at our table about investment firms. We often joke about this project that it's called Risky Business, but the subhead should be guys who worked at Goldman Sachs who like climate change. So it's like, that's basically who we have on the risk committee is Goldman people. So the goals of Risky Business, the project, which is an ongoing project, was really, again, to lead a bipartisan or nonpartisan, really, getting it outside of politics, business-focused national discussion about climate risk in the U.S. economy. And we wanted to do that, which is really a communications goal. But then we also had a research goal, which was how do we provide the data that decision makers doing climate risk analysis need in order to do that analysis? How do we actually help decision makers incorporate climate risk into their everyday activities? If we're going to tell people to do it, we have to help them figure out how. So how we did that is an interesting process for those who care about process. It really was a three-part project. It was unassailable research married to a very strong communications program, married to very, very good messengers who had national profile on economics issues or the sectors we looked at. So we brought together the three co-chairs, and then they brought in an extended risk committee, who I'll tell you about in a minute. And those are, it's an interesting group of co-chairs. I mean, Tom's really got a background in investment in the hedge fund world. Mike Bloomberg, of course, I think the New York Times called him Mayor of Earth the other day, so he's really got a lot of things going on. And then, of course, Hank Paulson, who ran Treasury during the financial crisis and is very thoughtful about that and has written a lot, actually, recently about how that's comparable to the kind of coming climate crisis. Those three came together as our messengers, and then we commissioned a risk assessment from the Rhodium Group, which was a deliberate choice. It's a group that's done a lot of risk assessment for the oil and gas industry, among others, and so they are not viewed as being overly partisan. On the research side, RMS, which is Risk Management Solutions, also came in as a partner for our coastal modeling. They are the premier world risk management firm for the reinsurance and insurance industries, particularly on coastal impacts. And then finally, we ran this like a real risk assessment, which is to say, we analyzed the risk, we did ranges of risk, we did tail risk, and we did not offer solutions. We left it to the audience to say, I understand the risk and I'm going to evaluate my vulnerability and my solutions. That was an incredibly controversial decision to not include solutions, and it's something sort of interesting to think about. We were unable to get support from the traditional environmental funder community for this project, largely because we did not dictate policy solutions in the project. And that was a deliberate decision, and I'll just tell you this because it's interesting politically. The one thing that got the Republicans onto the risk committee and the conservatives onto the risk committee was that we did not dictate solutions. So it was the single most important thing about the project from a political standpoint. You all are experts in risk, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but I just wanted to say briefly, why did we take the risk approach? As I said, the real goal here was to shift the discussion to be about economics and mainstream business, and we looked at how that was done on climate change in other places, particularly in Europe, which had this thing called the Stern Review in 2006. Sir Nicholas Stern, former World Bank economist, led it, and that actually accomplished a similar thing in Europe. What Sir Nicholas did was to, it's Sir Nicholas, I think that's right, was to do a cost-benefit analysis. He essentially laid out what are the costs of climate change, what are the solutions, and how do those compare. We looked at that, and then we looked at the U.S. political and cultural landscape and decided we could not take a similar approach. That laying out the benefits, the kind of solution side, would again lose us all the conservatives and make this inherently not nonpartisan. So instead, we decided to take a risk approach, which is a very standard approach. And this turns out to be a good way to look at climate change because what a risk approach does, you guys know this better than I do, but allows you to look not just at the most likely scenario, but at the tail risks, at the potential for 1 in 20, 1 in 100 risk that something will happen. Less likely, potentially more catastrophic if it happens, particularly if there's what they call a fat tail. So if the tail risks are particularly significant and go far out. Climate risk is very much in that mode. This is something that, unlike, for instance, war and terrorism, which is a classic thing people do risk analysis on, gets worse over time if you don't deal with it. I guess war and terrorism is probably like that too, but climate change, if we continue emitting at our current levels, we're actually compounding the interest. We're actually compounding the problem into the future. So what this slide shows you is what was a 1 in 100 risk becomes a 1 in 20 risk, becomes likely over time if we don't address climate change. Our outside tail risks become our likely scenarios. And so it's particularly useful to look at the tails, which nobody had really done in a national study on climate change before this. So these are the risk committee members, and I'll go through who they are in case you don't immediately recognize them. We have Mike Bloomberg, of course, and then Hank Paulson, Tom Steyer, Henry Cisneros, former HUD secretary and now a major real estate investor in LA, particularly in urban areas and infill development. That's Greg Page, who some of you may know with the glasses there. He is the executive chair of Cargill Corporation, was the CEO for a number of years. Down at the bottom, Bob Rubin, you probably recognize. Donna Shalala, former HHS secretary, now president of the University of Miami, I guess only for a few more months, but which is really at the crosshairs of climate change. George Shultz at the bottom, who really was the secretary of just about everything that you can imagine. 6 cabinet positions in that man's history. Unbelievable fact about George Shultz. Senator Olympia Snowe, former senator from Maine. And then down at the bottom, Al Summer, who was the dean of the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins for a long time and is a world-renowned epidemiologist and public health expert. So this group came together and commissioned this study. And the study itself, we didn't stop, you'll be happy to know this, the academics in the room, we did not stop with just with the high-level principal people. We also had an entire group of academics as peer reviewers on the research side of this project, most of whom were never seen by the public, but anyone who digs into the research knows that we then had this group of academics. And if you know them, you know that this group too is bipartisan, which was actually sort of an interesting thing for us to bring in some sort of more conservative academics and academics who had fought bitterly over the modeling in the Stern Review, for instance, but came together in this project. So let me just stop there for a second because you'll read the next one if I go to it. We wanted to do this, we wanted to accomplish these goals in a way that we thought would really work. And so we were very data-driven about how we pulled it together. And one thing we did, and I'll just say to you that this is a audience research we did that has never been made public, and this is actually the most I've ever talked about it, but you seem like the right group to talk about it too. We did a survey of 400 bond raters, issuers, and investors to understand their attitudes about and how they were actually incorporating climate risk into their decisions in order to do this project and talk about it in an effective way. So those surveys were done by Cambia, which is a public research firm that's also run by Republicans, that did, again, about 400 surveys. And the top lines of this were, and I'll go into a little more detail, were basically people believe climate change is real and it will have an impact. It's very hard to model the risk of climate change to particular industries, and that's a barrier to people incorporating it into modeling. And people are skeptical it can be modeled. So that was interesting. So I'll go into the differences between bond raters and issuers and investors in a minute, but those were the top lines and really drove a lot of what we did. So very quickly, I'll go through these. Basically, people believe it's real. They vary in how much they think it matters to investment. I'm not going to linger on this slide. It's a factor for people, but it's a low down on the list. So it's a factor in investment decisions, but it is down below a bunch of other things. And I don't know if you guys can read that. I can't read it from up here, but things you would imagine. I mean, liquidity, inflation, even extreme weather is above. The only things that are below, war and terrorism is below. Natural disasters is below, I think, on one of them. But it's down on the list, but it's a factor. People vary on whether it can be reliably calculated, and the bond raters think it can, and the investors think it cannot. And that was interesting. And then similarly, I'm going to skip that one. Similarly, the raters are currently already incorporating it into a lot of their modeling, and the investors are not. So What that says, and I think that's changed a lot. This was in May of 2014, and I think this has actually changed even in the last 6 months. But what this says, this has been borne out in the project, is that long-term investors who have really long-term, someone was talking earlier about how we all think we're long-term investors, but in fact, bond raters really are. I mean, people making 40, 50-year decisions, infrastructure decisions, have a very different approach on these numbers than people making 2 or 3-year investment decisions. Not surprising, but important when thinking about the investment community. Who are we talking about? What kinds of investments are we talking about? Who is responding to the way we talk about climate risk and climate change? For investors that are not currently modeling climate change, the biggest barrier that they told us about was a need to understand how to model it consistently. How do you measure climate change consistently? And that was an interesting thing that we ended up approaching in our research. And then finally, this is just a slide about sort of why include it. And the two biggest factors that people said were the best argument to including is, one, the kind of urgency convincing factor piece, Hurricane Sandy, Katrina, we see it happening. And the second was it's a key economic and financial risk. I think that middle one is the most important for this group. This is something you have to include. It is a key financial risk going forward for investors. So this research really influenced us in how we messaged this project, but also how we did the research. So again, we had decided to do a very actionable piece of work, and this convinced us that we had to do it at a granularity and a scale that was actually useful to people. So what we did and was a very kind of an academic and interdisciplinary approach, bringing together the science, the econometric research, so how much do things cost when they happen, sectoral models for 3 sectors: energy, agriculture, commodity agriculture, and coastal infrastructure. And then we integrated all that into a big model and came up with a bunch of numbers about climate risk. And I'll go over those really quickly, and then I'll talk a little bit about kind of the role, what I see the role is for universities and colleges and all of you in all of this. So we designed the report, which is all available, by the way, on riskybusiness.org. You can find it. It's an interactive website. It's very fun to use. We designed the report around the same regional definitions that were used in the National Climate Assessment. All of you from California are looking at this and thinking, we're not in the Southwest, which is exactly what I thought when I looked at this, but this is how climate modelers do the country. So we used their models because that's what was already out there. I should tell people that we are doing a second report that's coming out next week in Minneapolis that takes a deeper dive into the Midwest region and does that by metro area. So we're actually doing detailed analysis of the 10 metro areas in the Midwest, as well as a much more detailed analysis of commodity agriculture in the Midwest next week. So keep your eyes peeled for that. So we did these regions. I'm not going to make you read this, but essentially this slide is the slide that says all the stuff we didn't do. What we did do was model temperature, in particular precipitation, which is hard to do, and sea level rise. What we did not do was a bunch of other things, including things like ocean acidification and a bunch of other things. We did the most conservative and available modeling that we could. So heat is the best correlated thing to climate change. That's why people call it global warming. You can say a lot with very strong certainty about heat. You can say a lot with less certainty about precipitation. Heat is directly related to sea level. You can say a lot about that. Beyond that, you start to get into a lot of speculation. So we wanted to stay super conservative on the modeling. We really only looked in detail, again, at energy demand and energy costs, at agriculture, but commodities. So we did wheat, corn, cotton, and soy, and then at coastal infrastructure. And then we did the secondary impacts from heat. So we did labor productivity, mortality, heat-related mortality, and violent crime. And the national report did not touch on violent crime, but the Midwest one will. We left violent crime out of the national report because we thought it was all that the reporters would ask us about, and we wanted the story to be slightly different than that, but we left it in the metro areas. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. So really quickly on what we found. Coastal infrastructure, the way we did this modeling, and if you look at the report, you'll see it is very, again, there's ranges for everything. Mostly these are likely numbers, and where we pull out a 1 in 20 case or tail risk, we say so. But we did all the coastal infrastructure modeling about the basically existing property and what its value is. So this is all about the average cost of storms and then the value of property that would be underwater if these storms happen. And we did both sea level rise and storm surge. So this number's been quoted a lot, the $35 billion total annual price tag for hurricanes and other storms on the eastern seaboard. That number's been in the news a lot. That's a high number and pretty significant for those areas. You can see here that the hardest hit areas, states by far over time through mid-century and late century, are Florida and Louisiana. This, I think, is an interesting slide because this is what happens to coastal property in those states. I mean, Florida, Miami is built on limestone. It's a porous substance. The water comes up through it. You can't build seawalls to stop the water. So Miami is really, Miami, Coral Gables, all of those southern cities will be really affected. So will, you know, the Louisiana cities that are below sea level. People investing in that property today are not paying attention to this. But bond raters thinking about things like stadium bonds and infrastructure bonds in those cities are starting to pay attention to this. And I think that's actually potentially really going to change the pricing in the market. We looked at inundation, which is just what happens when the sea levels go up. So these are cities that have a big inundation risk. We also looked at storm surge. Hurricane Sandy wasn't an inundation issue, it was a storm surge issue. Sea level rise get high, New York is still okay until there's a storm, and hurricanes get more frequent in climate change, and then it gets inundated, and then you get something like Sandy. And that's an important difference, those two things. We looked at energy demand. This is a really important impact from heat. Not surprising to any of you, particularly who invest in energy and utilities, but as it gets hotter, a couple things happen. First of all, people use their air conditioning a lot more, and that means electricity demand goes up, and it means that there needs to be more build out, and then ratepayer amounts go up, so cost goes up. So air conditioning goes up. It's not completely offset by warmer winters in the north. People in the north have warmer winters, but they're mostly using oil and natural gas. People where it gets hotter are mostly still using coal and increasingly switching to natural gas and other systems, nuclear in the southeast. So costs go up, the demand goes up, but at the same time, it's really hard to run a centralized power system when it's really hot out. So these systems need cooling, constant cooling, nuclear in particular. You're cooling them down with warmer and warmer water, and you're using more and more water to cool them, and they become far less efficient, as do transmission lines. So your capacity goes down, your demand goes up, massive increase, as you see in cost. We're looking at up to 95 gigawatts of new power generation capacity by mid-century and up to $12 billion a year just to meet demand, just to meet the demand from new heat. This is different depending on where you live, and you'll see the Northwest actually does pretty well. We got a lot of people joked with us about this report that it must have been paid for by the Washington and Oregon, trade associations, because they do pretty well on the heat measures. The Southeast, with all things related to climate change, are the hardest hit. The Great Plains numbers are high because there's so much energy production in those areas, and it's very energy intensive. The Midwest is also very energy intensive. Here in the Southwest, there's a big bump you can see in energy cost because of air conditioning. Agriculture was one of the most interesting parts of this report, and really it was because we had Cargill very involved. So Greg Page is no longer the CEO, but he is the executive chair, and he has an executive job at Cargill. Every word in this report had to be something that he could stand by from Cargill. So that meant that he engaged his Cargill economists and his Cargill scientists in the report, and we got very good data on the agricultural side. And essentially the story is that without adaptation, certain parts of the country will have significant yield declines in commodity crops. Even with adaptation, there's a chance of pretty significant decline because the adaptation is mostly about irrigating more, and we're going to have water resource issues. So even with adaptation, you'll see those declines. This is where we talk a lot about the tail risks because they're very significant. Basically what this looks like is a giant resettlement of agriculture from one part of the country to another. It's not unlike the Dust Bowl, but it's like the Dust Bowl if it happened really slowly over decades instead of 2 years. Basically, and even the Cargill folks admit this, that basically you have Indiana, Iowa, and Illinois losing massive amounts of commodity crop, and those moving up north, and double cropping happening in the northern states. So a big shift. For a big company like Cargill, that might just be moving kind of icons on a map, but for farmers in Iowa, it's a big impact. So heat is the biggest impact we looked at, and everything I just talked about is heat related. And this slide just shows you, for those wonky people in the room who understand whisker graphs, which is what that thing is on the, I guess you're right, that's a whisker graph. That shows you two things. This graph shows you, number one, that there are several paths we could go on as a country. The one that we modeled in Risky Business, like in a normal risk assessment, is the path we're on. So we modeled what we're doing, which is that red one that goes way up, that red line that goes way up. We could get onto other paths, and a lot of the impacts I just talked about could be different, particularly around heat. Heat is the most controllable factor from climate change. Sea level rise is already there. We have baked in a certain amount of it. Heat factors, we can change the trajectories over time. So this chart tells you both that we're talking about the top graph, and you can change it. Also, it shows you that we looked at those, if you look at those whisker graphs, those like, you see the bars, those are the likely scenarios, and then the little tails on the top are the 1 in 20 probabilities. So let me just talk a little bit about what happens in different parts of the country, and then I will go into why do you care? Why does this matter to universities and colleges and investors? So this is where we are now. This region gets very hot. Going by the end of the century from an average number of days over 95 of about 40 per year to up to 110 days per year over 95 degrees. You can see that Southern California, Arizona are particularly hard hit by this increased heat. That's why those energy demand numbers are so high. Northeast is not looking so dire, but the Northeast actually has some interesting heat and humidity impacts that I'll talk about in a minute, but you're still getting, up to 60 days above 95 degrees per year by the end of the century, which is pretty significant for that region. The Southeast is the big, loser in climate change. There's the global South. We talk about the global South and climate change. The U.S. South and climate change is not a dissimilar story in the context of the U.S. This is important from an investment standpoint. Even if you're not there, some of you, I know there's at least someone from Georgia here, some of you are in the Southeast, and you're dealing with this from a place-based, what happens to my institution and my infrastructure. But recall that the Southeast is also where the United States has now placed most of our manufacturing infrastructure and a great deal of our energy infrastructure. So this is a very important region from the standpoint of long-term investments in some of the big things we invest in, manufacturing and energy. The Midwest, it just really depends on where you are in the Midwest. And the story from the Midwest I now can tell you is the southern states look much more like the South. The northern states actually lose a lot of their days below freezing. So the big issue in the northern states isn't the increased heat in the summer. It's much more about the fact that there's less ice cover, there's less recreational sports, there's more insects, there's more weeds, there's far fewer cold days in the Midwest. And then the Northwest does great. Hank Paulson and I went up to Portland to talk about this report, and he was joking with the business people in the audience that the biggest economic risk to Portland was that everyone from Texas would move there. And you should have seen the audience. They were like, no, Texans. It's very funny. They don't even like Californians up there, so you know how they feel about Texans. The Northwest does pretty well. This caveat, we did not model ocean acidification, which is an issue for this region. We did not model wildfires, which are an issue for this region. So just all that said, they go up to a lot more hotter days, but they actually look pretty good. This is one of the slides that gets passed around a lot. This is an important impact that people don't talk about that much, which is we call it humid heat stroke index. It's actually called wet bulb temperature. Any of you scientists out there will know this as wet bulb temperature. This is essentially heat and humidity, right? It's not just the heat, it's the humidity. This is so the human body, basic science lesson, we cool ourselves down by sweating, right? And we sweat, and then our sweat evaporates, and that cools our bodies down, the evaporation of our sweat. If the heat outside is high enough, and it's humid enough outside, our sweat cannot evaporate. And so our core body temperatures rise. So humid heat stroke index at level 3, which is about 90, which is called 92 degrees, but don't think of it as 92 outside. Think of it as a combination of heat and humidity that reaches this 92 degree kind of wet bulb temperature. That can raise the human core body temperature to above 104 degrees, which is heat stroke, within 20 minutes of being outside. We've never had a day in the United States. We've had one day in US recorded history that's hit this level, which was in Appleton, Wisconsin, near where I'm from, which in about 1995. Saudi Arabia has had one day in recorded history that's at this level. No other place has. By the end, this is by the end of 2200, so this is far out. We will start to see a couple of days like this every year. And the eastern part of the country, we'll see potentially multiple days like this every year. This is what we don't want to happen. I mean, this is like the future we all want to avoid. It matters because it matters. It matters because we care about people being able to be outside, but it also matters from an economic perspective. It increases heat-related mortality. Interestingly, particularly among people in their most active working years, and I don't fully understand the science on this. It's very interesting, but it turns out that the people who can deal least with heat and humidity combination are most of the people in this room are people between about 30 and 55. And so prime working year people, which is interesting. So you guys can't deal with it, I can't deal with it. And so additional deaths, heat-related mortality, but the other interesting thing that had not been modeled before this, but now has been written about, one of our co-authors, Saul Shang, who's at the University of California, Berkeley, has written a peer-reviewed paper on this now. There's a big impact, one of the biggest impacts on the national economy from all of this stuff is heat-related losses in labor productivity. So people who are in high-risk activities, construction, some manufacturing, some agriculture, transportation, can't actually do their jobs at this kind of heat and humidity level. And you see this number of 3%, and if you're not a labor economist, you're probably thinking that doesn't sound like a very big percent. But 3% loss in labor productivity is just about what we lost in absolute labor output in the 2008 recession. It's about 50% more than we lost in the 1980 recession, for those who remember that. So it's a pretty big deal to have this kind of loss in labor productivity. You particularly see this in the Southeast. These are the states with and their percentages of people in the industries that are most high risk for labor productivity losses. North Dakota on there as the clear winner in people in activities that are high risk, and that is almost entirely because of people working on the Bakken Shale. So that is all about extraction, those numbers. But every state in the country has at least 20% of its labor force in these activities. So this is not a small thing, and it just piles on to the impacts that we're already seeing in energy and we're already seeing in agriculture. As someone was saying earlier, energy, ag, and water are impacted industries from a heat perspective, from a precipitation perspective, and also from a labor productivity perspective. So what does this mean for everybody here and your clients and the people you work with? Well, I think at the very kind of most obvious impact is that, again, you all work with place-based institutions. So we've found in general that the most affected investors and the most affected multinationals businesses are those that are place-based and making long-term investments. Universities are place-based and making long-term investments. Campus facilities investments, campus investments that have to be located where they are. So an obvious impact is think about where you're located and the investments you're making and where you want to invest. That seems like a kind of a low-hanging fruit. We've already seen this, of course, in New York during Hurricane Sandy, where there were extreme, or first of all, during Katrina, this is LSU, so during Katrina, where the medical center had extreme impacts from the flooding. Also, there's just some more pictures of that. Also at NYU, this is a now famous story of NYU during Hurricane Sandy, evacuating everybody from the medical center because all of their energy systems were in the basement and were flooded. But that's one set of impacts. But as we've all talked about today, and I've been really impressed by kind of everyone in the room thinking beyond place-based issues and beyond adaptation, is in a whole host of other areas. So universities, I mean, I guess my sort of pitch on this project and in general coming out of it is we can't think of this as just being in one bucket of things. It's not just about campus sustainability. It's not just about adaptation with your place-based investments. It's not just about divestment, which has actually become sort of in some ways a new partisan rabbit hole that people have gravitated to. Getting out of all those buckets and thinking bigger, universities really can look at these issues in a huge variety of ways. Adaptation, yes, but also mitigation. How do we start thinking about aligning investments and also doing investments, place-based investments that simultaneously adapt and mitigate? A great example of that, of course, is in energy. Those energy impacts I talked about, energy demand impacts and cost impacts, are the result of having centralized power systems, which are very hard hit by extreme heat. Diversifying our energy systems, making them more distributed, doing more rooftop, getting away from big centralized power, and going into renewables is a way to both avoid those impacts and also start mitigating because you're using less carbon. It's one of those marriages of those two things. Campuses are in a really good position to do that, and actually there's some great work going on now, I know in California and other states, to change state policies so that direct access is possible by campuses, and you can build microgrids like the Department of Defense is doing and really get off of those centralized power systems. So that's exciting. You're the place where people learn about this stuff. And I really think that universities, I've really learned from this project the value of doing an interdisciplinary approach, getting out of your environmental sciences program, getting out of your environmental education programs, and making this an issue in first-year business classes, in economics programs. Making this a mainstream issue across programs is incredibly important and something universities can do. Obviously, education and workforce development, and then their whole investment and divestment debate, which you all talk about much more eloquently than I do, but I've been really encouraged today, even in the last presentation, to hear about the myriad ways of talking about that. It doesn't just have to be about divesting from a thing. It can also be about reinvesting in something else, about managing portfolio risk, about thinking holistically across investments, to think about sort of where are you putting those dollars, and how are you incorporating climate risk into those decisions. I almost hesitate to put this up because ASU is not the Arizona University on this slide. It's Northern Arizona University. Apparently ASU is not the most sustainable university in Arizona. I'm sorry. Sorry, Michael Crow. But you're probably close. When I put this up at the college president's event, you should have seen everybody. They were like, it's very funny. It was like a NCAA ranking slide. But campus sustainability is, of course, again, one clear way to start dealing with both this adaptation and the mitigation issues we talked about. Modeling behavior. There's a really good paper that just came out literally last week from Severin Bornstein at Berkeley, who wrote about campuses doing their own carbon taxes. And this is a new idea that's floating around now that's very interesting. So not only modeling good behavior in terms of where you're spending money or how you're doing sustainability, but actually thinking about doing some kind of a carbon tax on your own system and really evaluating the inputs and how the university is using different products. It's an interesting idea. I don't know enough about it, but I think those kinds of ideas, direct access to power ideas, are very interesting and ways that universities can start to kind of move the ball forward. Interdisciplinary research is really important. This is becoming a bigger and bigger deal at universities, and I'm really encouraged by it. These campuses are starting to look across different institutions and not just do climate change or climate risk within one field or one school, but actually start to look across all of these different fields. It still is not, in general, a first-year business course. Climate risk is usually something that business students take at another school or they take as a special option. It's something that we are working on with Risky Business to build into a case for first-year business students, not as an entire year, but just a case, because people think that has to change. I'm also really encouraged by crowdsourcing. I mean, one of the biggest changes that's happened in the last few years, just from a data perspective, is that we now have the cloud and the ability to crowdsource. So our project, for instance, it's useful to people because it's very, very granular. We did county-level data by sector on climate risk in particular areas. That took 20 terabytes of data. We could not have done that if there wasn't a computing cloud available. I mean, we used, I think it's the equivalent of 100,000 servers or something, or it's 100,000 computers. It's really a huge amount of data. Crowdsourcing as well, both Wisconsin and MIT are doing these projects where academics from all these different fields are building into these systems and teaching each other about the science and about the engineering and the economics. Then, of course, there's the divestment debate. At Stanford, Alicia Seeger, who we work with a lot, actually, wrote a great article about Stanford's decision to divest from coal. And Stanford, as people have talked about really well, is struggling with this. Other universities, San Francisco State, I was really happy to hear, working on this. It's a very difficult and knotty problem. And I think, again, really encourage people to kind of not let it be defined for you by those who want this to be about divestment as if that's a simple thing, but really sort of thinking above that about what does the portfolio look like, what is the role of a university, how can we think about making this a mainstream part of how we do business and how we think across different areas of the university, not just sort of putting it into a divestment bucket and having that fight, but broadening back out to having a real dialogue, which this group is really doing. And you'll see also, this is Senate Pro Tem leader Kevin De Leon in California. He just made an announcement about divesting the CalPERS to CalSTRS money from coal as well, and this is his speech about that. So definitely there is a trend toward doing this on coal, and that's the thin edge of the wedge, and I think that's really interesting and will teach us a lot of lessons about how to do it. So the last thing I'll say is, again, going back to, it doesn't have to be this way. This is not about me being up here making dire predictions about the apocalypse and making everybody feel like they can't do anything about it. This is a choice. The risk analysis is an analysis of what we're doing today. It's of our current emissions pathway and our current decisions, and it's about our adaptation at the level it is today. This, like any risk analysis, I really believe it's a call to action. I don't think that risk assessments should disempower people. I think that they should be seen as roadmaps for action. How do we manage that risk? How do we mitigate that risk? We can mitigate that risk in a variety of ways by adapting. Some of it's going to have to be adaptation. You're making investment decisions today that will be on the ground and in the ground for 50 years. Those decisions have to be made in the light of what the world will look like in 50 years if we stay on our current path. We have to be calculating those things in because we don't know what the path will look like, and we need to use the best available data. So those decisions are being made today, and we have to adapt to them. But it's also a conversation about avoiding those worst case impacts, and that's about mitigation, which for you, at the local level, those making local decisions, that's really how do you lower your carbon footprint? How do you think about diversifying energy? How do you think about making those decisions? But then the bigger you get, the bigger your portfolio, the more multinational you are, the more you interact with policymakers. Universities are very influential with policymakers. The more it becomes about influencing the public sector and the global economy to change the way these decisions are made. Ultimately, this is going to have to be about pricing carbon to change all of the economics of what I just said. But pricing carbon is something that is not where we should start the conversation. We should start the conversation with where people feel like they have power, and ultimately, I believe we will get to a place where people feel like they will push for us to get off this path because we can't stay on it, and frankly, and live the way we do now. The only reasonable course is to alter the path that we're on. And I think we can do that. I think universities and colleges are actually in somewhat the best position to both do that themselves and also influence the public sector and influence the world to do that. So I'm excited to get to talk to you guys about this. I'm happy to answer questions, and I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.